Hello, and welcome to Database Design, adding attributes to your entities. Once again, my name is Bob Niels. The goal of this particular video is to teach you about what an attribute is. So we'll understand what an attribute is, we'll understand how to determine attributes of an entity, and finally, we'll apply it to our entity relationship diagram. Okay, so what's an attribute? Well, each entity is associated with some details known as attributes. These details, for the most part, are the characteristics that make up the entity. So attributes are additional information about a specific instance of an entity. And again, as you see here, I capitalized the word instance. What do I mean by that? Well, when we talk about an entity, every occurrence within that entity, instance within the entity, represents a single domain, if you will. So we have students. So every student that makes up an entity, so let's just say Bob Niels is a student, all my characteristics about me will be part of that also. So basically, it's a row, it's a record, it's whatever you want to call it. But for the most part, it is an instance of that entity. Does that make sense? Okay. And so these are the characteristics, the individual characteristics of that particular entity, that noun. It could be name, it could be address, it could be gender, it could be race, it could be date of birth, it could be all kinds of things. It could be anything and everything that needs to be stored about that particular entity. All right, and that is exactly what an attribute is. Nothing hard about it, but that's exactly what it is. So where does these things come from? How do we know what to put in there? Well, we just don't make them up. I mean, obviously we don't make them up. So possible attributes are determined throughout the requirements gathering phase. That's where they're all, for the most part, gathered. That's where we actually get all the information, is from the requirements gathering. As you understand the entities, their relationship, you will find the characteristics about their makeup. Usually this is done through, once again, all the interviewing and everything associated with it. Okay? Please note that, we went through a requirements gathering in a pretty quick way last week. For the most part, there's a lot more to learn about requirements gathering, and we have other courses that are part of most of your curriculums that will actually go into great detail how we gather those requirements. And as part of that requirements gathering, it's actually important that we get into the data dictionary, we call it, which is a compilation of all the attributes about each entity. And then within that data dictionary, we determine certain things. What makes up all the things that make up each entity as part of our requirements. Okay. And so we get pretty deep into that. It's something that an analyst will make sure actually happens. And we'll make sure that we are conversing that information with our clients to make sure that we have actually accomplished in understanding every characteristic that we need to know and store about each entity. So it just doesn't happen automatically. It's not something that you make up. It's something that comes from the process of developing an application. And like again, as part of that is the requirements gathering. All right. For the most part, when we get into it, even when we're in requirements gathering, some of the obvious things, attributes are very obvious. Okay. And then for student, if we're going to store something like a student or an employee or a customer, more than likely we want their names. We got to know who they are. And so first name and last name. We try not to store the whole name because we can't really sort on that. So we like to store first name and last name, address, city, zip, whatever it is we want to know about these particular ones, particular types of entities. Some of them are very obvious, okay? As a student, obviously first name, last name, your address, your phone numbers possibly, and so on and so on. Email addresses, things like that. Everything we want to know, demographically, to understand who you are and make sure that we can get a hold of you, and so on. Those are the things we would probably want. All right. Some of the attributes might not be as obvious. Sometimes those come out based upon drilling deeper into the requirements. And if you recall, one of the things we want to know about requirements is what is it that the client truly wants out of this system, or they want to be able to get out of this database. All right. And sometimes asking those questions in the requirements is where entities pop up at. For instance, if If the client wants to know, be able to report on the age of students who took a particular course, we know we would probably have to store birth date, even though we may not have felt that was obvious at one point, as an example. In this case, it becomes very obvious because if we that type of reporting, we couldn't get it out unless we knew the actual age of every instance, in this case, every student within our database. Does that make sense? But once again, it's nothing to really fret about. In the end, it's part of the data modeler's work to make sure the decision about what is actually in the model. Um, that is true. In some cases, somebody might say, well, a nice characteristic about a student is what their hobbies are. If we're never going to use that data, I don't think it's something we actually want to store. So once again, there's consideration as we're building our databases about what it is we really want to know and why we want to know it. And in the end, what we're going to report on and what kind of information does our client truly need. This is not an exact science, and obviously you guys are learning this for the first time. So don't worry about it too much if you don't get them all. The whole idea is you can perfect your database, and with that, you can always add and you can always take away. But with that said, I want to make sure you understand it's a lot better to try to collect as much information up front and get your design correct than try to build upon it later on. Sometimes some of those updates later on could really cause what do I want to say, a major rewrite of the database, or even a minor rewrite to a major rewrite of the database. It doesn't happen very often, but something you need to consider. So the more design you do up front and the more knowledge you have in regards to understanding what should be in your database, the better. Okay, so as a quick example, we had this particular set of requirements when it came to our students' course instructor example we did in previous videos. And I don't need to read this to you again. This is where the college wants, the students register for courses and so on. But based upon this, for your assignments in the future, we'll probably add more notation there so you can actually determine the attributes as you move forward. Something similar to this, the student data must include basic demographic information, including first name, last name, and address. In addition, their gender and social security number is needed. An output requirement states that the client wants to be able to filter that data by age and also by race of a student who took a particular course. Once again, some kind of an example I just spoke about. So with that kind of information, what will our attributes be? Well, then for students, we can probably determine that this might be our set of attributes: first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, gender, date of birth, race, and social security number. If we continue on with the requirements, there might be a line in there to state something like, for courses, we must save course number, course name, and also course start date. That's pretty simple. With no other information available about courses, that will be our attribute list. And finally, for instructor, basic demographic information again. And in addition, the client wants to know how long they worked for the college at any particular point in time. All right, with that said, first name, last name, address, city, state, zip, and date of hire. Let's talk about date of hire for real fast, and the same thing about date of birth. We never want to store a total in a sense, or something that can always change, I guess is what I want to say. You don't want to store those type of attributes. So age, for instance, actual age of a person. With that said, if we actually stored the age of a person every time they had a birth date, we would have to go in and change it. We don't want to do this. In this case, date of birth, date of hire, we can derive how long one worked for a place or how old he or she is. Does that make sense? How would we derive it? Well, we can derive it with SQL statements, which you'll learn about this in this course, or through programming code. So you store the information needed to be able to derive output, and age and amount of years worked, that's output. Okay, so how do we put this to our Visio ERDs? It's actually pretty simple, and I started it for you already. So as you can see here, as you remember, I had this students entity here, and there was these little things here all the way through. It's called attribute one, all the way down, attribute, attribute, attribute. For the most part, I started adding a few of them in here, and let me just show you though how you actually add more. So with this said, you can actually pull an attribute over, just like this. A new attribute name, double click on it, and see we have date of birth. Let's see what else we need in here. Race, And we'll do one more. And again, just kind of put it there toward the end. Visio takes care of putting it to the appropriate entity for us. And this would be race and I think social security number. All right. Uh, let's see. Up here, courses, I already finished that for us. Again, if you recall, that attribute name was all the way through. All I did was just type on it, just double click on it like this and change the name. Okay. And then instructors, the same type thing. We had first name, last name, data hire, and there's a few more attributes we wanted to add to it, but we'll just save that for later, okay? But you kind of get the idea. And of course, in your assignments, you need to be complete. So I'm just trying to save you time and not having to watch me type. So you get the idea, very easy to add your attributes. And now all of a sudden this ERD is taking on more of a design piece where it's sitting back talking about the relationships, the entities, and also the attributes that make up and define each entity. All right?